and we'll pass over to Anthony then to look at the whole issues of governance and what organisations should be doing. And there's some lessons there. So thanks, Sarah. We'll move over.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nigel. I mean, I think it's, you know, my job here is to try and sort of pull governance into all the things that have been said by my colleagues earlier into the sort of organisational way. I mean, governance is theoretically the act of governing or overseeing an organisation. Now, what we've been talking about today is really ethical stuff, and integrity has come out on a number of occasions. And basically, you know, we have had some very, very obvious situations where the governance of some organisations has gone very, very wrong. For those of you who've been watching the BBC recently, you'll have seen some of the issues that have fallen out of Grenfell, where people have been deliberately falsifying elements of the building that caused a dreadful thing at Grenfell. I've had the privilege of chairing a group which was trying to work out how to make sure these sorts of things never happen again. And a lot of that sits around the behaviours, and indeed, as has been said before by many of the speakers, is listening to other people. A big issue about Grenfell and the influence on the residents has been that the residents did not have any influence and were not listened to when they were pointing out errors of service, errors of judgment, errors in all sorts of things. So, and in fact there, we've seen that the investigation there has showed that they have widespread and persistent wrongdoing. They sold products that they knew that were dangerous to life. I mean, that is not good governance. Other episodes of that, some of us might remember Enron and the consequences to Anderson when they was convicted of obstruction to justice. So governance is really a matter of getting all these risks that Sarah's been talking about and all the other elements, which I'll come on to in a minute, into the pot at the top. So the people who are responsible for this is the C-suite as we're often called, actually lead the company properly. And I say a company, any organisation, it can be any organisation. As Nigel himself says, we need to lead people from the top. And culture is most definitely something that's led from the top. And I would suggest to you that governance is, or the culture of governance within an organisation, are you going for the quick buck, or are you going to go for a good company that's ethical and has integrity? Now, in order to do that, we need the checks and balances, as Nigel has also said. So we need to understand what all the risks are to our organisation, need to be able to assess them. As Sarah's pointed out, a risk is also an opportunity, which is something that's often forgotten in a lot of the presentations that I hear. And when people are looking at risk generally, it's always a negative. It isn't, it's a positive. It's very important that transparency is absolute in my view, because if you don't know what you're dealing with, as we just heard, you have no idea where you're going. And as Nigel opened up the discussion, it's necessary to have the purpose in life. So governance is about all of that. What do we have in our organisation? What are people doing? What are we seeking to address? And what are we seeking to deliver to all the stakeholders? Now, the word stakeholders is, of course, another issue. One needs to look quite hard and wide to consider all the people who could be affected by what they call in law your undertaking. A health and safety law is very much about the employer or the owner of something, but it also means you've got to protect the general public and all of those others who could be affected by your work. Now, governance, therefore, needs to understand all these different influences. It's very hard for a single person to take it all on board. Often within an organisation, you'll have an audit committee, and the audit committee will take information from various parts of the organisation, analyse it against the perhaps the mission statement or the stated financial expectations, and hopefully, as Paul has been talking about, the triple bottom line and other climate change aspects that are coming in. It's basically the whole overarching method in which, and the processes and the information gathering and analysis for the whole organization in order to get you to go where you want to go to. It's not new. I mean, originally, I say originally, but in 1999, the Turnbull Code, some of us again might remember, that was put out in earlier recognition that governance was not as good as it should be. We've had, as mentioned before, social contribution to the communities in which you serve and with which you communicate and with which you integrate. You know, if you're developing buildings and such like, you have a huge impact on the communities with which you're providing these services. That particular code has been upgraded and reviewed and was last issued by it's called the Risk Guidance Report by the Financial Reporting Council. That was back in 2014. I have no doubt there'll be more reviews, fairly certainly after these Grenfell and what have you, because the outfall from that is enormous. If I come back to risk, because often within governance, or the discipline is known as GRC, quite often governance, risk and compliance, and the three are really quite different. In looking at the governance of an organisation, and if you're looking at the managing board, the typical sort of way of looking at it is three lines of defence. The first one is management control, which is the front-end employees. Are they doing actually what they should be doing? And then you've also got to tell them what they should be doing, and when we have policies and procedures, and we have to train them into that. Now, if we're not providing that, and if we're not listening to them coming back and saying, I can't do this this way because, and forcing them, we're going to get ourselves into trouble. But this is the first line of defense, is to make sure that they are able to do what you expect them to do. Second line is the sort of risk and the auditors, the compliance checkers. So they're checking that the guys down the bottom end of the pile, for the coal face would be a better expression. They're checking that they're doing it. And the third one is the internal audit department. So right at the top, the board is the third line, because at the end of the day, it's the board who are responsible to all for the delivery of governance, good governance across the business. It must be remembered, of course, that we should be looking at the supply chain, particularly in this day and age. We'll remember the dreadful outfall of the garment factory in India, where there was a terrible fire and the impact it had on the reputation of the various clothing retailers in this country. But going further than that, governance has got to include the things like modern slavery, the living wage perhaps, diversity, BAME, and all sorts of things. So the governance of the organisation and the governance of the board must have information in order to check that their policies and procedures, which should hopefully be, how do I put it, should be positive towards all these matters, but there is also a responsibility for them to test that the information they're being given is accurate. Because it's all very well to sit there and have a nice, as Sarah was saying, a nice chart of green risks. However, if you never ask what those risks are and how they've been and what the information's been given to you, then you'll actually no wiser. You're dependent on somebody, which is fine. But every now and again, you must test these things. And that is particularly important in the matter of governance generally. There's also, it's not always the large risks, it's not always the elephants, I would say, that are a risk to a company, particularly if you get down to into the field. I call it death by...
Have we lost Anthony? I think Nigel's on mute there at the moment.
Sorry, I was looking at Anthony's screen because he's gone to mute as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was
That's
trying to
the-
anticipate what he might be about to say. So death by power cuts, something, something like that as a whole.
Yes.
Just while we wait for Anthony to come back, Nigel, do you have any comments with regards to what he's saying there from a governance
Yeah, I
perspective?
do. Yeah, a number of them. Sorry for those attending. Anthony's in Italy, so he's having a bit more of a challenge with the technology than some of us. And not all of us necessarily. This issue about the breadth of scope of governance is particularly important, I think, to me, because I've been in organisations where we've had a board of governors, and quite often their focus and their interest is very narrow on one or two things. Like, for example, in a college or a university or a training organisation, and they're interested in a couple of things. And they're often in the position of governance because they have a vested interest in something. And part of what he was saying then is this thing that we've got to be so careful of trusting information from a vested interest.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me all the way through this is that at this time of year in particular, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and the current way of doing things is very suitable for all of those people who are in power now. They love it. Why would they want to change it? It's going to make their jobs harder, make them less money. Sorry, you're about to speak.
No, I was just going to agree with you on that. I mean, how many organisations have we worked in or worked with where people are desperately trying to report good news up to that board? And I mean, I was certainly taken aside before the first board meetings that I was ever involved with. And, you know, it was like, Sarah, there are 3 rules here. Number 1, don't embarrass the CEO. Number 2, don't embarrass the CEO. And number 3, don't embarrass the CEO. It was a bit like Fight Club. And I think that that's something where sometimes organizations are kind of pressured just to report that good news up. And as Anthony was saying there about the green lighting or the watermeloning, as sometimes we call it. So you're just getting green lights reported up through the organization, whereas in fact, there are red lights everywhere. And for whatever cultural reasons, that things are being hidden, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I think that that's something where inadvertently some forms of governance have been supporting that way of doing things. And if we're going to get governance to work properly and actually support what we've been talking about today in terms of care, maybe there are sort of slightly different flicks that we can do with regards to that.
Absolutely. I remember being in a board meeting as an advisor once in a quite substantial organisation of not many millions of pounds, where the chief exec actually admitted to me, by the way, I've never actually understood what any of these figures mean that come through in the management accounts. I just look at the FD, and if the FD doesn't look worried, I assume it must be all right. Because couldn't ask any searching questions because no idea what he was asking. See, Anthony's reappeared at the top of the screen there.
Yeah, sorry, there's a lack of resilience and good governance there. Somebody's tripped over the bloody plug.
Can I just give you another sort of 4 minutes then? If you
that's fine. I mean, I was really wanting to just underline the importance of looking at the supply chain, because actually in this day and age, I mean, we're looking now at Felixstowe and what have you. You know, people, it's, you know, that was, again, that's not a black swan, though they might be talking about it. And the other fundamental thing, I think, is that people have to own risk, and that includes the board. You cannot stick your head in the sand, as Sarah's been saying. You know, it just really doesn't work. And this has been absolutely drawn to the fore by the Grenfell investigation. The most appalling behaviours going on there. I quickly mention a bit about compliance. Compliance means is conforming with stated requirements, is a common term. But that, I would suggest, actually means your contract, it means your corporate policies and regulations. And people tend to think of it as compliance with regulations. And you've actually got to do more to run your company properly, you know, and you need to be checking that your suppliers are doing that as well. And when you're undertaking a look at the suppliers, you need to be, if you have a policy on diversity within your organisation, or an attitude to common use or energy, and you state that you're going to be doing X or reducing Y, you need to check that all your suppliers are doing the same. They're in line. And the other thing I would say really is that none of this is of any use whatsoever if you haven't got evidence of it. If you haven't got evidence of it all, it's of no value to you at all, in a regulatory term anyway. And indeed, I would say out in the public that they won't understand if you've got evidence. If people are now it's very easy now to check people. Greenwash, as it used to be called, doesn't work. And a very great deal of that is down to the behaviours of the people right the way through the organisation, led from the top. But I have often seen middle management, in fact, referring to our working at home issues with COVID at the moment. I work for an organisation at the top of the tree, were very keen on the communication, understood it very well. They'd taken I think it's about an hour's training from an expert in Canada about communication and how this is going to be vital. And it got totally lost in the middle of the company. Some people were very good at it, but I would suggest that a good third of the middle managers, you know, the team leaders or divisional heads, whatever level it was, just ignored it. And as a result, that company had quite a lot of health problems with people being out there. But to wrap up, Nigel, and thank you for letting me go on a bit, but I think it's important to understand why this is important, other than engaging properly with your employees and your stakeholders. It's becoming increasingly important to have good governance, evidenced good governance, by way of your reputation. You need evidence of this sort of stuff for tenders now. The capital funds and fund managers, green funds and sustainability are looking very closely at what people are doing. Again, you need to evidence it. We spoke earlier of youngsters and millennials and what have you. They are very keen to see that companies and organizations are operating properly. And if you're going to attract best talent, then you're going to need to be the best in breed with your behaviors, your integrity, and indeed your governance. It's obviously a protection of your reputation. But to wrap up, I just say it is vital, as we were speaking about, it is the leadership of the organisations in embracing everything we've all been talking about and wrapping it all up in a good governance and having the integrity and promoting an excellent corporate culture. So we've got some time for some questions. I'll be very happy to take any.
I've got one just come in, particularly, which is an interesting thing about the idea of boards. We tend to talk about a board as if it's a thing, rather than a collection of individuals who all have different perspectives, personalities, attitudes, intentions, desires. What can we do to be more human about our view of boards and to make them much more of a shared thinking arena?
My view would be that for start, they need to be more diverse, which I think has been recognised. Because what we need is, what we have as humans is all have a different perspective of everything. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. Your upbringing, my upbringing, another person's upbringing, all going to have an influence on how they perceive a particular issue. Now, whether that be a risk, an opportunity, you know, the colour of the wall, it's always different. So the more diversity we can get into a board, the better chance we have of having a rounded approach to whatever it is we're trying to discuss and promote, really. So that would be my answer, is the easiest thing. And in order, and I would say if it was ever a good chance, was to get people to understand open listening, you know, proper listening.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because now, going back to the points that several people made, yourself and Sarah too, this is a great opportunity for us right now. One of the things I've been saying to people I've been working with is that you've got permission to change anything now, absolutely anything. You know, because often what stops it is that people resist changing their routines and it gradually drifts back. Right now, everybody's ready to do anything differently. We've got to address
that. I would concur with that. The trouble is they might run off in different directions. So again, the governance and the board and the managerial processes need to harness that energy and direct it and keep it directed and where they're going. Because people who, you know, if the workforce, and by the workforce I mean from top to bottom, are running off doing their own thing, governance is lost, compliance is lost, risk management's akimbo, and you have an enormous problem in keeping the tanker on the straight and narrow. Organisations tend to be, I mean, the smaller organisations can chop and change quite quickly, but they need to look at the elephants, obviously, before they make the changes.
Absolutely. I think there's some good points there. I mean, I think one thing about this is working out how much scaffolding we need and how much freedom we need. There's a big
Correct.
Organisations, I think, have often overdone the compliance thing to protect their backsides.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think I think a lot of it is, a great deal of it is about transparency. People, talking about compliance. Compliance, if I say it can be overdone, you can't tick every box every day of the year, and if you're held as the, I'm trying to think of the controlling mind of an organisation, you're in a very perilous position. And actually, by engaging and having good governance and promoting your one's assumed integrity throughout your business, you've got half a chance of surviving, is all I'd say.
Yes, absolutely. Probably no more.
Yes, probably no more. But I mean, I think some of these enormous corporations, and they're getting, they're bigger than countries, some of them, but one or two of them, for instance, I'm trying to think of what the company was that it wasn't Capital, it was the other one that failed for the government, not Tarmac. It was the government, the government lot that failed and brought down an enormous lot of issues for the whole of the local governments, schools and everything else when the PFI collapsed. So,
Carillion, yes.
Carillion, thank you very much, Julia. There's such a ream of these things.
Yeah, exactly so. Of course, it is an ill wind that blows nobody good, because I worked with 2 or 3 organisations that picked up millions of pounds worth of business from that collapse. So
indeed, but the issue there is, I suppose what I'm alluding to is that they weren't very transparent with the position they were in.
Oh, absolutely.
And as a result, it caused an enormous amount of damage to an awful lot of people, purely because a few people wanted to cover their proverbials.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to me, good governance and integrity is based on behaviours. It's dependent on the behaviours and the culture exuded from the top, and it needs transparency, that people can prod the apple barrel and get the answers they want. And I think people are now beginning to accept that nothing is rosy all of the time.
Absolutely.
They prefer you to admit your errors and get them right. And
again, going back to the opportunity that we have now, this is the time to do it. Strip your sleeves and show your powers. Thank you for that. Fascinating.
Thank you for extending me.
Yes, all the way from Italy.